constituents aren't left behind by Labour once again?
Well, my honourable friend is right to welcome the landmark reforms that we announced earlier in the year, which will be the biggest changes to English property law for over 40 years. Of course, I would like to see them apply in Wales as well, and we have had conversations with colleagues in the Welsh Government. I would strongly encourage them to take the same approach that we are, which is to ensure there's always fairness for leaseholders, and those reforms come into place across the whole of England and Wales.
Let's head up to Mohammed Jassim. Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Given the scale of need for help with home adaptations for the rising number of older people with disabilities, dementia, and now the impacts of long COVID, will the Secretary of State commit to increasing disabled facilities grant funding so local authorities like Bedford Borough Council can stand a chance
Prime Minister has given the authority for his statement to last longer than 10 minutes. And Order. Before I call the Prime Minister to address the Chamber, I'd like to point out that a British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on the Parliament Live TV. I now call the Prime Minister to make his statement. Prime Minister!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with your permission, I will make a statement on the roadmap that will guide us cautiously but irreversibly towards reclaiming our freedoms while doing all we can to protect our people against COVID. Today's measures will apply in England, but we're working closely with the devolved administrations who are setting out similar plans. The threat remains substantial, with the numbers in hospital only now beginning to fall below the peak of the first wave in April. But we're able to take these steps because of the resolve of the British public and the extraordinary success of our NHS in vaccinating more than 17.5 million people across the UK. The data so far suggests both vaccines are effective against the dominant strains of COVID. Public Health England has found that one dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine reduces hospitalisations and deaths by at least 75%, and early data suggests that the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine provides a good level of protection, though since we only started deploying this vaccine last month, at this stage the size of its effect is less certain. But no vaccine can ever be 100% effective. Not everyone will take them up, and like all viruses, COVID-19 will mutate. So as the modelling released by SAGE today shows, we cannot escape the fact that lifting lockdown will result in more cases, more hospitalisations, and sadly, more deaths. And this would happen whenever lockdown is lifted, whether now or in 6 or 9 months, because there will always be some vulnerable people who are not protected by the vaccines. There is therefore no credible route to a zero-COVID Britain or indeed a zero-COVID world. And we cannot persist indefinitely with restrictions that debilitate our economy, our physical and mental well-being, and the life chances of our children. And that is why it is so crucial that this roadmap should be cautious, but also irreversible. We're setting out on what I hope and believe is a one-way road to freedom, and this journey is made possible by the pace of the vaccination programme. In England, everyone in the top 4 priority groups was successfully offered a vaccine by the middle of February. We now aim to offer a first dose to all those in groups 5 to 9 by the 15th of April, and I'm setting another stretching target to offer a first dose to every adult by the end of July. As more of us are inoculated, so the protection afforded by the vaccines will gradually replace the restrictions. And today's roadmap sets out the principles of that transition. The level of infection is broadly similar across England, so we will ease restrictions in all areas at the same time. The sequence will be driven by the evidence, so outdoor activity will be prioritised as the best way to restore freedoms while minimising the risk. At every stage, our decisions will be led by data, not dates, and subjected to 4 tests. First, that the vaccine deployment programme continues successfully. Second, that evidence shows vaccines are sufficiently effective in reducing hospitalisations and deaths. Third, that infection rates do not risk a surge in hospitalisations which would put unsustainable pressure on the NHS. And fourth, that our assessment of the risks is not fundamentally changed by new variants of COVID that cause concern. Before taking each step, we will review the data against these tests. And because it takes at least 4 weeks for the data to reflect the impact of relaxations in restrictions, and we want to give the country a week's notice before each change, there will be at least 5 weeks between each step. The Chief Medical Officer is clear that moving any faster would mean acting before we know the impact of each step, which would increase the risk of us having to reverse course and reimpose restrictions. I won't take that risk. Step 1 will happen from the 8th of March, by which time those in the top 4 priority groups will be benefiting from the increased protection they receive from their first dose of the vaccine. Mr. Speaker, all the evidence shows that classrooms are the best places for our young people to be, and that's why I've always said that schools would be the last to close and the first to reopen. And based on our assessment of the current data against the 4 tests, I can tell the House that 2 weeks from today, pupils and students in all schools and further education settings can safely return to face-to-face teaching, supported by twice-weekly testing of secondary school and college pupils. Families and childcare bubbles will also be encouraged to get tested regularly. Breakfast and after-school clubs can also reopen, and other children's activities, including sport, can restart where necessary to help parents to work. Students on university courses requiring practical teaching, specialist facilities, or on-site assessments will also return. But all others will need to continue learning online, and we will review the options for when they can return by the end of the Easter holidays. From the 8th of March, people will also be able to meet one person from outside their household for outdoor recreation, such as a coffee on a bench or a picnic in a park, in addition to exercise. But we're advising the clinically extremely vulnerable to shield at least until the end of March. Every care home resident will be able to nominate a named visitor able to see them regularly, provided they're tested and wear PPE. And finally, we will amend regulations to enable a broader range of COVID-secure campaign activities for local elections on the 6th of May. As part of Step 1, we will go further and make limited changes on 29th of March when schools go on Easter holidays. It will become possible to meet in limited numbers outdoors where the risk is lower. So the rule of 6 will return outdoors, including in private gardens, and outdoor meetings of 2 households will also be permitted on the same basis so that families in different circumstances can meet. Outdoor sports facilities such as tennis and basketball courts and open-air swimming pools will be able to reopen, and formally organised outdoor sports will resume, subject to guidance. From this point, 29th of March, people will no longer be legally required to stay at home, but many lockdown restrictions will remain. People should continue to work from home where they can and minimise all travel wherever possible. Step 2 will begin at least 5 weeks after the beginning of Step 1 and no earlier than the 12th of April, with an announcement at least 7 days in advance. If analysis of the latest data against the 4 tests requires a delay, then this and subsequent steps will also be delayed to maintain the 5-week gap. In Step 2, non-essential retail will reopen, as will personal care, including hairdressers, I'm glad to say, and nail salons. Indoor leisure facilities such as gyms will reopen, as will holiday lets, but only for use by individuals or household groups. We will begin to reopen our pubs and restaurants outdoors, and honourable members will be relieved there will be no curfew and the Scotch egg debate will be over, because there will be no requirement for alcohol to be accompanied by a substantial meal. Zoos, theme parks and drive-in cinemas will reopen, as will public libraries and community centres. Step 3 will begin no earlier than the 17th of May. Provided the data satisfies the 4 tests, most restrictions on meetings outdoors will be lifted, subject to a limit of 30, and this is the point when you will be able to see your friends and family indoors, subject to the Rule 6 or the meeting of 2 households. We will also reopen pubs and restaurants indoors, along with cinemas and children's play areas, hotels, hostels and B&Bs, theatres and concert halls will reopen their doors. And the turnstiles of our sports stadia will once again rotate, subject in all cases to capacity limits depending on the size of the venue. And we will pilot larger events using enhanced testing with the ambition of further easing of restrictions in the next step. Step 4 will begin no earlier than the 21st of June. With appropriate mitigations, we will aim to remove all legal limits on social contact, and on weddings and other life events, we will reopen everything up to and including nightclubs and enable large events such as theatre performances above the limits of Step 3, potentially using testing to reduce the risk of infection. Mr. Speaker, our journey back towards normality will be subject to resolving a number of key questions. And to do this, we will conduct 4 reviews. 1 will assess how long we need to maintain social distancing and face masks. This will also inform guidance on working from home, which should continue wherever possible until this review is complete. And it will be critical in determining how Parliament can safely return in a way that I know honourable members would wish. A second review will consider the resumption of international travel, which is vital for many businesses which have been hardest hit, including retail, hospitality, tourism and aviation. A successor to the Global Travel Task Force will report by the 12th of April so that people can plan for the summer. The third review will consider the potential role of COVID status certification in helping venues to open safely, but mindful of the many concerns surrounding exclusion, discrimination and privacy. And the fourth review will look at the safe return of major events. Mr. Speaker, as we proceed through these steps, we will benefit from the combined protection of our vaccines and the continued expansion of rapid testing. We will extend the provision of free test kits for workplaces until the end of June, and families, small businesses and the self-employed can collect those tests from local testing sites. Mr. Speaker, in view of these cautious but, I hope, irreversible changes, people may be concerned about what these changes mean for the various support packages for livelihoods for people and for the economy. So I want to reassure the House we will not pull the rug out. For the duration of the pandemic, the government will continue to do whatever it takes to protect jobs and livelihoods across the UK. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, will set out further details in the budget next Wednesday. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we must remain alert to the constant mutations of the virus. Next month, we will publish an updated plan for responding to local outbreaks with a range of measures to address variants of concern, including surge PCR testing and enhanced contact tracing. We can't, I'm afraid, rule out reimposing restrictions at local or regional level if evidence suggests they are necessary to contain or suppress a new variant which escapes the vaccines. Mr. Speaker, I know there will be many people who will be worried that we are being too ambitious and that it is arrogant to impose any kind of plan upon a virus. And I agree that we must always be humble in the face of nature and we must be cautious. But I really also believe that the vaccination programme has dramatically changed the odds in our favour, and it is on that basis that we can now proceed. And of course, Mr. Speaker, there will be others who will believe that we could go faster on the basis of that vaccination programme. And I understand their feelings. And I sympathise very much with the exhaustion and the stress that people are experiencing and that businesses are experiencing after so long in lockdown. But to them, and to them all, I say that today the end really is in sight, Mr. Speaker, and a wretched year will give way to a spring and a summer that will be very different and incomparably better than the picture we see around us today. And in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
I now call the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and for the telephone call between us earlier today. Mr. Speaker, this is the third time the Prime Minister has announced a plan to come out of national lockdown. In the past, we've emerged without sufficient caution, without a clear plan, and without listening to the science. We can't afford to make those mistakes again. This has to be the last lockdown. Now, the vaccine rollout, as the Prime Minister said, has been remarkable, and I want to pay tribute to everybody involved. It is the light at the end of the tunnel, but if we're going to get there, we have to tread very carefully. So I'm glad the Prime Minister spoke today of caution, of this being irreversible, of assessing the data and following the evidence. Those are the right guiding principles. And I have to say it's a welcome change from some of the language the Prime Minister has used in the past. And I urge the Prime Minister now to stick to that. Turning to the substance of the matter, first, schools. We all agree that the priority must be for all children to be back in school as quickly as possible and to stay in school. We want that to happen on March the 8th, as the government has promised. Confidence of parents, teachers and school staff will be critical. So can the Prime Minister please confirm that the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officer support the full reopening of all schools on March the 8th? And will he commit to publishing all the relevant medical evidence on this issue? Can the Prime Minister also indicate what the government is doing to overcome the huge logistical challenges this presents? The Prime Minister touched on mass testing in his statement, but there was nothing on Nightingale classrooms and extra capacity. This is a huge problem, particularly for schools with smaller buildings. So can the Prime Minister update the House on how he's going to deal with this in just over 2 weeks' time? Let me turn to a linked issue. Within weeks of schools returning last autumn, thousands of teachers and school staff were self-isolating, causing huge disruption to the running of schools and children's learning. We don't want that again. That's why we called for the early vaccination of all teachers and school staff. In my own constituency, the fantastic Crick Institute, which has been doing amazing work, has been vaccinating hundreds of people a day. They've been very clear to me and publicly that they could be doing more. And it's obvious to me that over one weekend, they could have vaccinated all teachers and school staff in Camden if they'd been allowed to do so, and without bumping anyone else from the priority list. There are similar examples across the country. So will the Prime Minister see what more can be done to speed up the vaccination of teachers and school staff to ensure that children and young people not only return to school on March the 8th, but stay in school having returned? Let me turn then to isolation support. As we release health measures, however gradually, there's a risk that infection rates will go up. The Prime Minister made that clear in his statement. Therefore, it's more important than ever that test, trace and isolate is working and working well. One of the most concerning figures in a recent SAGE report is that only 3 in 10 people who should be self-isolating are actually doing so. And it's obvious that one of the main drivers of this is insecurity at work. As the chair of Test and Trace has said, people are scared to take the test because they can't afford to self-isolate. That not only harms our health response, it costs the economy too, and it's got to be fixed. We've proposed that the £500 isolation payment, which is currently only available to 1 in 8 workers, be made available to everyone who needs it. Will the Prime Minister consider that? Because if we don't shift the 3 in 10 figure, there'll be a huge hole in our defences. Third, Mr. Speaker, economic support. The Prime Minister announced a roadmap today, but it won't have escaped businesses that many of them will not be able to open until mid-April at the earliest, and many until mid-June. Now, I'm not questioning the health basis for that decision, which I support. But I am reiterating what we've always said, that health restrictions must be accompanied by proper economic support. And it makes no sense to announce today that businesses will be closed for many more weeks or months without announcing new economic support at the same time. The Prime Minister says, well, the budget will be next week. But there's nothing stopping him saying today that business rates relief will be extended, that furlough will be extended, or that the VAT cut for hospitality and leisure will also be extended. Businesses are crying out for that certainty, and the Prime Minister should give it to them today. The Prime Minister should also announce proper support for the 3 million self-employed who've been left out of all support for the last year. This morning on LBC, I was asked about this again by a self-employed businesswoman who's at her wit's end at the lack of government support. This roadmap means that she may not be able to get up and running again in her business until mid-June. So surely the Prime Minister needs to act now to close the gaps for these 3 million. Mr. Speaker, we support the twin principles that the Prime Minister has set out today, that lifting of restrictions must be both cautious and irreversible. But I know the Prime Minister will come under pressure from those on his own benches to go faster and to throw caution to the wind. Last week it was reported that around 60 of his own members of Parliament called for the end of all restrictions by the end of April. I'm sure there are going to be similar calls this afternoon. I hope the Prime Minister takes the opportunity to face this down. Because if this roadmap is to work, he needs to listen to the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer, not the honourable members for Wickham or the Forest of Dean. If the Prime Minister does, he will have our support and will secure a majority in the House. If he does not, we will waste all the sacrifices of the last 12 months. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Well, I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his overall support for the roadmap, and indeed I welcome his support for the vaccine rollout, and I'm sure that many people will be glad to hear what he says. I can't help but reminding you, Mr. Speaker, that the right honourable gentleman did vote to stay in the European Medicines Agency, which would have made a vaccine rollout at this speed impossible, Mr. Speaker. And he's right to say that it's a priority to get schools back safely, and I'm delighted that he agrees with that. And I can certainly say that the plan for March the 8th for all schools back on March the 8th is supported by the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Advisor, and it would be a good thing if he could perhaps persuade some of his friends in the unions to say so as well, Mr. Speaker. And finally, to say that schools are safe. He mentions self-isolation, the importance of self-isolation. We will continue to support those who are asked to self-isolate and indeed increase our package of support for them. As for support for business, for the self-employed, which he rightly raises, we will continue to put our arms around businesses and livelihoods around the country, as we have done throughout the pandemic, and the Chancellor, who has been extremely creative in this respect, will be setting out the details in the budget next week, as he would expect. Mr. Speaker, overall, I think we can safely say that we've had cautious support from the Leader of the Opposition today, but bitter experience has taught me that his support is very far from irreversible, Mr. Speaker. Who knows what he will be saying next week, but I'm glad of it today.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer the House to my entry in the Members' Register. Can I say to my right honourable friend that I welcome his statement today. I particularly welcome the return to schools on March the 8th. But there's another sector which is important for jobs in my constituency, which is fundamental to our economy and critical for global Britain, the aviation sector. He says there's going to be a task force report by the 12th of April so people can plan for the summer. That won't allow people to plan. At every stage, the government has taken weeks from these reports to actually provide certainty to the industry. The industry needs 3 months' preparation from the point of certainty. So I ask my right honourable friend to look again at this timetable for that task force report, to bring it forward so we can open up our international air travel and make sure that Britain is open for business.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and she is quite rightly, Mr. Speaker, a doughty campaigner for the aviation industry and all it brings to our country. And what I can tell her is that we will continue to support that industry throughout these difficult times, but I believe that setting a deadline of April the 12th for the report of the Travel Task Force, the newly formed, reconstituted Travel Task Force, will give people time to make their plans for the summer. And if things go well, Mr. Speaker, if we can meet those these not before dates, then I do believe there is every chance of an aviation recovery later on this year.
Let's head to the leader of the SNP with Ian Blackford. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The success of the vaccine rollout, led by our incredible NHS staff, is something to behold and something that we are all thankful for. For the first time in many months, people across these islands are genuinely hopeful that an end to the current level of lockdown is finally in sight. But people also know that there is one major threat that could undo much of this hope. The spread of new international variants of this virus now poses the single biggest threat to finally getting out of this pandemic. That is why quarantine measures for international arrivals is so important. We simply can't afford to get this wrong. And that is why the Scottish Government has taken tough but absolutely necessary action. Those arriving in Scotland on an international flight have to quarantine in a hotel for 10 days. In England, though, the policy only applies to people travelling from red list countries. But, Mr. Speaker, the evidence shows that people across the United Kingdom are demanding stronger measures to prevent the threat of any new variant. YouGov polling last week showed that only 18% support the UK government's rules on quarantine, while a massive 72% of people across the United Kingdom prefer the Scottish Government's comprehensive approach. Prime Minister, your plan to end lockdown will be worthless if your insufficient quarantine measures allow a new variant in through the back door. People right across the United Kingdom are continuing to make huge sacrifices. Children are not yet physically at school. Families are isolated. There is a loneliness epidemic. People are really struggling, and this can't be all for nothing. Do not leave the back door open. Do not risk all the hard work, all the sacrifices that have been made. Given all that is at stake, can you explain why the UK government is failing to introduce the strong quarantine measures that the public across the United Kingdom are demanding? Will the Prime Minister think again and introduce the Scottish Government's comprehensive approach for international travellers? Let us all do what we need to in order to drive down the spread of the virus, to get us all to a position where we can reverse lockdown and begin to restore social interaction for all our well-being.
Mr. Speaker, we have amongst the toughest quarantine measures anywhere in the world, as the Right Honourable Gentleman well knows, including the mandatory incarceration in hotels appointed by the government if you return from one of the 33 red list countries, as he well knows. And we will continue to impose very, very tough controls on people coming into this country. He should also know that the new variants we are confident that all our vaccines are effective in reducing death and serious disease, and we have no reason to doubt that they are effective in reducing death and serious disease with the new variants as well, Mr. Speaker. And he should also know that over the course of the next few months we will see new vaccines to defeat these vaccine-escaping variants, and that is something that is evolving the whole time. Other than that, Mr. Speaker, I was delighted by the unaccustomed note of optimism with which the Right Honourable Gentleman began. He isn't often notable for his optimism in this House. He's rolling his eyes, Mr. Speaker, but I rather liked it when he began with optimism. I think he should stick to it. I think it suits him. More optimism, I think, from the right honourable gentleman would be I think, nice to hear.
Let's head to the chair of the Select Committee with Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, talking of optimism, the Prime Minister's approach feels very similar to Harold Wilson, who said he was an optimist, but one who always carried a raincoat. And his caution is absolutely right in the face of these new variants, when we are potentially so close to the finishing line. But as we get there, will he recognise the brilliant work of our health and care staff by building back better for them, potentially in next week's budget, by announcing that we will finally make sure that we're training enough doctors and nurses with a long-term workforce plan, and giving the social care sector a 10-year plan, just as we gave the NHS 10 years ago?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I pay tribute again, as I have many times before, to the incredible work, not just of our NHS staff, but of our social care staff, who've really borne the brunt of the pandemic and have done fantastically well. And we will certainly be bringing forward reforms of social care in addition to the massive investments that we've already made.
Let's head to Ed Davey. Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, the roadmap to recovery must put people hit hardest by this pandemic first, not least people with learning disabilities. They have died at rates more than 3.5 times the rest of the population, yet many are still not being prioritised for vaccination. Jo Wiley has spoken powerfully about how hideously unfair it was to be offered the vaccine before her sister Frances, who is now in hospital with COVID, after an outbreak in her care home. And I know many other carers across the country feel the same, while our loved ones remain so vulnerable to this virus. So will the Prime Minister tell us when on his roadmap everyone with a learning disability will have been offered their first jab?
Prime Minister.
The right honourable gentleman is entirely right to draw attention to the particular suffering endured by vulnerable groups throughout this pandemic, and that's why those with learning disabilities, those with particular vulnerabilities, do appear high up in the JCVI priority list, which is, I'm sure, exactly what he would expect.
Let's head to Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. Sir Ian.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, can I congratulate my Prime Minister for his incredible bold decision last year. It's due to that, in getting the vaccines rollout going on, that we are now looking at the eventual end to this COVID nightmare. So he deserves all the plaudits he gets for that and more. But I agree with his caution in this rollout and going back to being unlocked. But I just say that the hospitality sector, to my right honourable friend, is the biggest, very big employer of the poorest in society. And it is them who has suffered the most in incomes. And nearly half of those businesses are talking about closing. I just wonder whether the Prime Minister would feel it possible to be able to review again the nature of opening up inside those restaurants and pubs and checking that there is no real risk beyond any of the other elements that he's opening up. And if that is the case, to take that bold decision as and when the data dictates it.
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for what he said just now, and I totally understand where he's coming from and the urgency of those in the hospitality sector who want to open up as soon as possible, as indeed we all do. Everybody in this House wants that to happen. But we also understand the risk of another surge and the consequent risk of a fourth lockdown, Mr. Speaker, which I don't think anybody wants to see, least of all the businesses concerned. And what we have in this roadmap are dates. Admittedly, they are not before dates, but they are dates to which businesses can now work. April the 12th for outdoor hospitality, May the 17th for indoor hospitality. That gives at least some certainty, Mr. Speaker. And I think in this very, very difficult time, with these difficult trade-offs, I think people would be prepared to trade some urgency and some haste for more certainty and more reliability. And that is what we aim to give.
Let's head to Liz Saville-Roberts. Liz Saville-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Yfarydd. Workers across the UK still face a hopeless choice, self-isolating and suffering loss of earnings, or going to work where they risk spreading the virus. Now, 8 months ago, I raised this very problem of the UK's unfit sick pay system with the Prime Minister, but there are still people in work who cannot afford to self-isolate. Ahead of the budget, will the Prime Minister commit to raising and expanding statutory sick pay once and for all as a key long-term lesson to be learnt from this pandemic? Or is he content for our poorest communities to be blighted by ill health now and quite possibly again in future?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady. And repeat the points I've made to her many times before, but I'm grateful to her for raising them again. We will continue to look after people throughout the pandemic. We've increased benefits. There's the payment of £500, Mr. Speaker, and other payments that we'll make available. And our undertaking is to make sure that we protect people, whether they're self-isolating or whether they're forced not to be able to work throughout the duration of the pandemic. And you'll be hearing more about that from the Chancellor on March the 3rd.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thankfully, my right honourable friend has clearly stated today that an extreme zero COVID approach is impracticable. Can he confirm that most, if not all, of his key scientific advisers now accept that our strategic goal must be and is a practical, vaccine-based method of controlling COVID like any other serious respiratory virus, such as influenza?
My right honourable friend is completely right in the analogy he draws, and the only reason I'm able to say, Mr. Speaker, to the country is that we must learn to live with COVID as we live with flu, Mr. Speaker, in the long term, is of course because we have this vaccination programme and the capability to evolve our vaccines.
Let's head south to Caroline Lucas. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as welcoming the success of the vaccination programme, I want to emphasise there is a lack of sufficient financial support for self-isolation. There is, in the words of one of the government's own advisers, a huge gaping hole in the Prime Minister's COVID strategy. The payments aren't enough, they're not reaching the right people. So as well as fixing that once and for all, will he also take this opportunity to respond with the seriousness it deserves to the High Court's ruling on Friday that the Secretary of State acted unlawfully by failing to publish COVID contracts? No one has ever suggested that ministers didn't need to act fast to procure PPE and other COVID-related contracts, but transparency matters even in a crisis. So if the government has nothing to hide, will he now publish details of who benefited from the VIP lane, who lifted the velvet ropes for those favoured companies, what price were they paid and why were they chosen? Parliament and the country have a right to know.
Mr. Speaker, of course we'll continue to look after those who are self-isolating and to improve their support where we can, as I said. As for the contracts that she has just mentioned, all of the details are on the record, and of course it was right to work as fast as we possibly could to get the PPE that this country so desperately needed.
Said no to Imran Ahmad Khan. Imran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the medics and volunteers who've worked so hard in providing COVID-19 vaccines across the kingdom. In the Wakefield CCG area alone, more than 87,000 vaccines have been administered. The vaccine rollout is the fundamental rule out, ensuring that we are able to return to now lamented normality and properly follow the pathway outlined by the Prime Minister just now. Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned that vaccine disinformation has specifically targeted ethnic minority groups, leading to some refusing the vaccine when offered. Can my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, outline what step the government is taking to encourage BAME groups to receive the vaccine when offered?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I congratulate him on the spectacular throne on which he appears to be sitting, Mr. Speaker. But he and I, not so long ago, were together in the Al Hikmah a community centre in Batley, and I again thank all those involved, and indeed community groups up and down the land who are doing an outstanding job in promulgating vaccinations. He raises a very, very important point. I thank him for what he's doing to promote vaccinations for everybody.
Let's go over to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My constituents are seeking explanations. Most of them have lost income, many have lost their jobs, all are facing varying degrees of stress, from the very severe to the concern about their lives. Many local small businesses have closed for good because they see no future and they're not getting the support that they need. Yet, Mr. Speaker, I think answers are required from the Prime Minister. How £10.5 billion of NHS contracts were awarded without tender, how a further 99% of all NHS contracts were awarded again without tender, and that last week the court found that the Secretary of State for Health had not acted legally in the awarding of these contracts. And so I ask the Prime Minister to do two things. Will he end this scandalous privatisation of our NHS, which is happening before our very eyes? And will he also replace the Health Secretary with somebody who will stand by and obey the law and publish in advance all contracts that are due to be let, so the public can see how their money is being spent?
Well, Mr. Speaker, to the best of my memory, the Labour Party opposition were advocating during the earliest stages of the crisis that we should secure PPE from, I think, a theatrical impresario who specialised in capes and gowns, and a football agent who claimed to be able to get hold of masks, Mr. Speaker. We went as fast as we possibly could to get PPE, and those who are now denouncing us for going too fast were those who were complaining back then that we weren't going fast enough.
Said to David Simmons. David Simmons.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend and the government have rightly been unapologetic throughout this pandemic in determination to safeguard children's educational opportunities and well-being. Can the Prime Minister confirm that once all schools reopen on the 8th of March, the government will be putting in place all the measures necessary to keep them open, working with academy trusts and crucially local authorities to avoid any further disruption to our children's education?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful, my honourable friend, because that is exactly why we wish to take this cautious but irreversible approach, in order to make sure that we don't have to go back into measures that would keep kids out of school again. And he's quite right in what he says.
Let's head over to Jim Shannon. Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister and Government's progressive roadmap, which of course is underpinned by the incredibly successful rollout of the vaccine? And can the Prime Minister confirm that we have no supply issues and are on target to give the second dose to all of those on the NHS front line who are due their second dose within the next few weeks? And can the Prime Minister assure us that this will not adversely affect the continued supply and the availability of first vaccines for informal carers of those who are shielded? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is completely right to raise this, and to care deeply about supply. We have no supply issues at the moment, and we're confident that we can meet our targets.
Let's head to Sir Bernard Jenkins. Sir Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate the Prime Minister on the fact that there are sunlit uplands that now beckon us, but that he's right to say that the threat remains substantial, because while we're unlocking, at this stage, only a third of the adult population has been vaccinated. So what will the government be doing to minimise the threat of another lockdown, such as strengthening the track and trace and isolate operations, particularly at local level, providing COVID-safe spaces so it's easier for people to self-isolate who are infected, and to deploy testing capacity more effectively, such as, for example, testing school children twice a week in schools, as we're already going to be testing teachers?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right in the ideas that he puts forward. Test, track and trace has been improving the whole time over the period of the pandemic, and he's right to draw attention to the potential of lateral flow testing, not just in schools, where, as he says, we're going to be doing it twice a week for secondary school pupils after the first couple of weeks, but also rolling it out for companies, for local areas, local communities, to take it up as an additional support, an additional way of fighting the disease.
Let's head to Ruth Jones. Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister was in my right honourable friend's constituency of Torvine last week to see the vaccine programme being rolled out by the Aneurin Bevan University Health Board at Cwmbran Stadium. So I joined with him in thanking all the Welsh NHS staff and volunteers who are working so hard to save lives by rolling out the vaccine programme in this way. However, I wonder if the Prime Minister agrees with me and many people across Newport West believe that every single penny of public money must be accounted for. And if so, what's he going to say to his Health Secretary, who, according to the courts, breached his legal obligation by not publishing details within 30 days of contracts being signed? We've had 2 attempts at getting the Prime Minister to answer, so I'm hoping it's third time lucky.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ruthlessly to repeat what I said before, which is that I believe that it was absolutely right for this country to secure PPE as fast as we possibly could, indeed, as it has been right to roll out a vaccine programme as fast as we possibly can, and it was great to be in Cwmbran and to see what they're doing there, and that is thanks to the dynamic work of the NHS and indeed of everybody in the Department of Health and Social Care, including the Health Secretary.
Let's wander up to Mark Logan. Mark Logan.
Prime Minister, today I hosted a Zoom between Bolton North East's pubs, restaurants and the Minister for Small Businesses. Can the Prime Minister ensure we allow businesses enough time to improve our hospitality's operating data and make the dates in 2021 utterly delectable?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing to help local business and to rally them, and I would just say to them that if we can stick to this roadmap, and I believe that we can, then there is not long to go now for those businesses. There are for hospitality in Bolton. There are 2 dates. There's outdoor hospitality on April the 12th, and then indoor with all its potential on May the 17th. I do believe that gives some dates for us all to think about, for business to work towards, and I hope that will be of some reassurance to them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some eminent members of SAGE have indicated that they're concerned about a resurgence with the return of children to schools. So can the Prime Minister say whether the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officer support reopening schools in their entirety on the 8th of March? Because during the last term, many schools suffered an enormous amount of disruption because staff were off isolating. And isn't the best way to prevent that happening in the future to ensure that all school staff are vaccinated?
Prime Minister.
I have a deal of respect for the honourable gentleman, since he and I have clashed many times over issues in London, but I think he uncommonly showed a failure to follow what I'd already said in my answer to the right honourable gentleman. The CMO and the CSA both approve of reopening in full.
We now go down to Andrew Griffith. Andrew Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than anything, the nation's businesses need certainty in order to plan. Today's roadmap provides that certainty, and reopening schools is a welcome and critical element within it. Does the Prime Minister agree that, like navigating lock gates on a canal, it's important we now proceed sequentially, as fast as possible, but always in a forward direction?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as anybody who's steered a narrow boat or a canal boat or barge will know, in a canal, the important thing is not to oversteer one way and then be forced to correct and bump the sides of the canal as you go. And that's what we're trying to avoid, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're embarking on a cautious but irreversible approach.
Let's head up to Debbie Abrahams. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will leave till another time to ask the Prime Minister why we didn't have adequate PPE stocks, given exercise Cygnus in 2016 stipulated we need to increase our PPE stockpiles. But I was really concerned about the Health Secretary's tone on the media round yesterday, where he seemed to infer that he'd done nothing wrong and the judge was actually the one that was making a mistake. This is not how a healthy democracy works. So I repeat the questions of my honourable friend, the member for Brighton Pavilion. Will he publish all outstanding contracts, because there are outstanding contracts that have not been published, bring an end to the emergency procurement powers and reintroduce a tendering process?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can see that there's a concerted attempt to make a point here today about this, but I must say that I do think that every effort was made by the government to secure PPE as fast as we possibly could, and I think that's what the people of this country wanted. We ended up, I think, with 32 billion items of PPE, and we now have the capability, which I think will reassure her constituents more than anything else. We have the capability now in this country, thanks to Lord Dighton and the PPE Task Force and others, to make 70% of our PPE needs in this country.
Let's head to Craig Whittaker. Craig Whittaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is brilliant news that we've vaccinated 1 in 3 adults now in the UK. A huge testament to British science, the NHS, my right honourable friend, the member for West Suffolk and his whole team, and everybody involved in the vaccination programme, not least my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. But does the Prime Minister agree with me that because of his swift rollout of the vaccine programme, we're in a much stronger position now to start easing restrictions and putting us back on the path to some form of normality much sooner than would have been without a vaccination rollout programme?
Prime Minister.
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is completely right, and I thank him very much for what he has just said. The only reason this roadmap is possible, and we're one of a tiny number of countries around the world that have been able to set out a roadmap with dates and milestones this far ahead, Mr. Speaker. It's only possible because of the vaccination rollout programme.
Let's head to Neil Coyle. Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. People of this country have endured so much in the last year, including personal tragedies amongst the highest excess death toll, job losses under the worst damage to any major economy. But they've also seen the Prime Minister's closest advisor, Dominic Cummings, break the COVID regulations, the Home Secretary break the Ministerial Code, and now the Health Secretary break the law to hide crony contracts, all without consequences. Going forward, Prime Minister, will you end the system of one rule for your Tory powers and another for the rest of us?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think contained within that question was possibly another suggestion that we could have done things differently with the procurement of PPE. All I will say is that the contracts are there on the record for everybody to see, and I think most people in this country will understand that in very difficult, if not desperate times, last spring we had to work as fast as we possibly could.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Prime Minister's statement, especially on schools. He's right to be driven by the evidence. Professor Mark Woolhouse told the Science and Technology Committee last week that during the whole year, and I quote, there has been very, very little evidence of any transmission outdoors happening in the UK. So will my right honourable friends continue to look at the evidence and see whether it's possible to bring back outdoor activities like sports during the weeks ahead? I know with the spring weather coming, that would be a great boon to millions of people across the country.
Prime Minister.
Of course he's right to raise the point about outdoor transmission, and that's why on March the 8th, with the return of schools, we're also going to be seeing school sport, which is great, plus outdoor recreation one-on-one in the way that I described earlier on, Mr. Speaker. And then on March the 29th, it's the rule of 6 plus 2 households together, plus more sport outdoors, Mr. Speaker, of all kinds, up to and including, I think, the rugby with tackling, but without the scrums, Mr. Speaker, as I understand the guidance.
Right, let's go up north to Alan Dorrans. Alan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good afternoon. Analysis by the Royal College of GPs of NHS England's COVID-19 vaccination figures show that people of black ethnicity are half as likely as people of white ethnicity to get vaccinated, and people of Asian ethnicity are under 2/3 as likely as their white counterparts to accept vaccination. What additional specific steps will the Prime Minister take to encourage greater uptake of the vaccines in these communities?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the number of people receiving the vaccine is actually increasing in all communities on roughly the same gradient, but we're concerned, he's quite right to raise the concern that I think everybody has about uptake in some communities. It is now going faster, and what we've done is rolled out a network of community champions. I think we've put about £23 million into supporting community champions for hard-to-reach or vaccine-resistant communities. And just the most important thing is for everybody to get across the message that the vaccine is a wonderful thing. Everybody should get it. Get your vaccine when you get your message from the NHS.
Sir Graham Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome very strongly the reopening of schools? After what we've put them through over the last year, it's time we prioritise the interests of our children and young people. The Prime Minister also sets out a programme based on data, not dates, and that must be right. But will he please publish the precise criteria for each of those stages to be met? And finally, when the renewal of emergency powers is due, will he undertake to bring that vote to the House before the Easter recess and not after?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker. There's going to be a massive, I think, data dump is the word I've been quoted today. So colleagues may already have seen some of the data that's available underpinning the roadmap that we've set out, and there will, of course, be another vote in this House about these measures before Easter, and then those measures in turn, Mr. Speaker, elapse on June the 21st in the way that I've described.
Let's head to Rachel Hopkins. Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local council public health teams will continue to be pivotal in controlling the virus, but the government's decade of austerity and cuts has damaged their capacity, with the public health grant last year, 2020-21, being 22% lower per head in real terms compared to 2015-16. So will the Prime Minister tell the House when the public health grant allocation for this year will be announced, and whether it will include a significant real terms increase to ensure councils can continue to keep our communities safe?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm very grateful to councils, and particularly public health officials, for the incredible work that they've done in the last year. Absolutely amazing work that they have done. We are supporting them with another £4.7 billion, as she knows, to support local councils in everything they do, and we will continue to offer support throughout the pandemic.
We now go to Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, for his statement and for the precautionary approach that he is pursuing to lifting the lockdown. It is clear that the impact of COVID will be for a long time, and I would thus be most grateful if he could confirm that this plan is coordinated and synchronised with the measures that the Chancellor will announce in the budget, and there will be ongoing support for both badly affected businesses, sectors such as hospitality, and for those people who are relying on the £20 uplift to universal credit.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, we will make sure that we continue to look after people throughout the pandemic, as we have done since the beginning, and the Chancellor will be setting out exactly what we're doing next week.
We now go to Andrew Gwynn.
been under local restrictions since the end of July, and it's been a long few months. So can I welcome the roadmap out of lockdown and also the success of the vaccine? Now, as somebody who's just been just about shaken off long COVID symptoms, 11 months after contracting COVID, can I urge him not to forget those still struggling and the many more who will develop long COVID as a consequence of the latest wave of the virus? As the economy switches back on, as lives return to normal, will he also commit to do more for those who still don't have access to long COVID clinics, who still don't have access to support or help, so that nobody is left behind?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy, I'm delighted to see the honourable gentleman back on fighting form as somebody who's enjoyed lively on-screen debates with him in the past. It's good to see him back in shape. He's right to draw attention to long-term consequences of the disease, and we will do everything we can to alleviate suffering and to continue to invest in support for those who need it.
Mark Harper.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Prime Minister for the measures to get our children back to school on March the 8th. That's very welcome and something we've called for. I think he should be congratulated on that, and also for the speed of the vaccine rollout. Could I just press him a little on the thoughts behind vaccinating groups 1 to 9? So that's everyone over 50 and those 16 to 64 with a health condition that makes them vulnerable to COVID. Those groups account for 99% of deaths and around 80% of hospitalisation. So for what reason, once they've been vaccinated and protected from COVID by the end of April at the latest, is there any need for restrictions to continue?
Prime Minister.
He makes an excellent, my honourable friend makes an excellent point. The difficulty is that, of course, there will be at least a significant minority who either have not taken up the vaccine in those vulnerable groups for the reasons that the House has been discussing, or who, having had the vaccine, are not given sufficient protection. We believe that the protection is very substantial, but there will be a large minority who will not have sufficient protection. And the risk is that if you let the brakes off, Madam Deputy Speaker, then the disease could surge up in such a way as, again, to rip through a large number rip through those groups in a way that, alas, I don't think anybody in this country would want to see. So I'm afraid it's pure mathematics. There is still a substantial body of risk. And we also need to wait and see exactly what the effects of the vaccine are. There are some promising data, but I think what the country would want at this stage is caution and certainty and irreversibility, and that is what we aim to provide.
We now go to Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Throughout this crisis, the government has been slow to offer the financial support that people need. From 3 million people excluded from any support to thousands of people failing to self-isolate because they can't afford to miss work, it's clear we need to do more. To get through the next few months, can the Prime Minister confirm that the budget will bring forward adequate financial support for everyone who cannot work due to the pandemic, including those who are self-isolating, rather than the current system which sees too many people fall through the cracks?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I certainly can confirm that, and she should wait to see what the Chancellor has to say next week. And I think colleagues on all sides of the House would concede that the programmes of support that my honourable friend the Chancellor has brought forward have been extremely effective and generous by virtually all international comparisons.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the Prime Minister's statement. Those of us who represent constituencies where retail, hospitality and tourism is an absolute lifeblood will really welcome the dates and the fact that domestic holidays in England are open as normal for the summer. But could I ask the Prime Minister just to give a little more detail on the Global Travel Task Force, which reports by 12th of April, and that it will set out the requirements regarding testing, vaccination certificates, social distancing and face masks, and I hope an end towards quarantine.
Yes. Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Travel Task Force will be looking at all those things, quarantine destinations and so on and so forth. I think at the moment, one consideration is that we need to make sure that there are countries that will be willing to accept British tourists in the way that we would like to see. Some of them have stepped forward and said that they will, but they're currently not very numerous.
We now go to Emma Hardy. Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Lateral flow testing is central to the Prime Minister's educational reopening plans. So can he explain why our only real-world published figures from the student asymptomatic testing programme in Scotland before Christmas showed almost 30% of positive tests turned out to be false when subject to a confirmatory PCR? Considering the financial, educational and mental health impact of self-isolation, does the Prime Minister share my concerns that a lot of students are going to be told to self-isolate for no reason?
Prime Minister.
I don't recognise that figure, Madam Deputy Speaker, and lateral flow tests are extremely valuable in isolating asymptomatic positive tests and in helping schools to restart, and that's why we're pursuing them.
We now go to Suzanne Webb. Suzanne Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the statement today and the prudent and cautious measures to reducing lockdown restrictions. We have all had our role to play in combating this virus and a role which will continue for some time. So would the Prime Minister join me in saying thank you to all my constituents in Stourbridge for their continued patience and resilience, to the fabulous Dudley NHS, to my care homes, Mary Stevens Hospice, to all those unsung heroes, to my teaching fraternity, the army of vaccinators, to all key workers and those essential workers who have kept us fed and watered, all truly heroic efforts by one and all.
Prime Minister.
Well, can I congratulate my honourable friend on her brilliant question. I plant my flag firmly on everything that she's just said and echo it sincerely. I add my thanks not just to the people of Stourbridge for their patience and resilience, but to the people of the entire country.
Now going to Munir Wilson. Munir Wilson.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Too often, children and young people have been an afterthought during this pandemic. Aside from lost learning, many children are feeling anxious and lonely due to not seeing their friends, missing out on play and other activities. We know 1 in 4 has self-harmed in the past year, eating disorder rates are soaring, and demand for acute beds is reaching crisis point. So will the Prime Minister please commit to providing a ring-fence resilience fund for schools, as proposed by Young Minds, to ensure that young people are given the mental health support that they so desperately need?
Prime Minister.
She's absolutely right to draw attention to the endurance, the things that we've asked young people to put up with this year and over the last 12 months. There can't have been a generation like it that's experienced so much disruption to their education. And she's right to call attention to the pressures, the stress that has caused. And so we've invested massively in mental health provision particularly for young people's mental health. And one of the things we've done is appoint a young people's mental health ambassador in the form of Alex George. But the top priority for the government is now not just to get kids back in school on March the 8th, but to make sure that we remediate their education with a programme of much more than £1 billion. And the Secretary of State for Education will be setting out more about our plans to help those pupils later this week.
Now go to Sarah Dines. Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people of the country are desperate to be set free as soon as possible. As my right honourable friend knows, many of the tourism and hospitality businesses in Derbyshire Dales have been hit heavily by the pandemic. Can he please encourage the country to book self-catered, self-contained accommodation for staycation holidays in places such as Derbyshire Dales this summer, where families are able to minimise mixing with other people, but have some fun?
Prime Minister.
She is completely right, and as you will have heard just now, the option to book a staycation, all being well, Madam Deputy Speaker, is now there for April the 12th, and I can't imagine there are many destinations lovelier around then than the Derbyshire Dales.
Now go to Neil Hanvey. Neil Hanvey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the High Court ruling that the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care acted unlawfully by failing to comply with transparency rules, will the Prime Minister now publish the names of the companies awarded contracts that were introduced to high priority lanes by ministers, honourable members, peers and officials, and set out any material, financial or fiduciary responsibility or relationship between each company and the persons responsible for that introduction to the priority lane?
Prime Minister.
Yes. I'm grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. I repeat the answer I've given several times. All these contracts are published in the normal way.
We now go to Sir Robert Neal. Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Welcome the Prime Minister's statement, and we all recognise the huge work that's been done to make the vaccine rollout a success. But can I press him upon why some of the dates are set as no earlier then? If we believe in the vaccine, we believe in the programme, and we believe in the data, isn't the logic that if the data shows we can move to free up sectors of the economy sooner, we should not artificially hold them back? Surely that's following the data. Shouldn't there be a little more flexibility there?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we need to see, Madam Deputy Speaker, we need to see the data, we need to see the effect of each successive relaxation, and as I explained to the House, we need 4 weeks to assess whether or not the relaxation has caused a surge in the virus, because that's the time it takes. So from the unlocking of the opening of schools until the 12th of April, we'll need to assess that. Then we'll need a further week to give people due notice, and the same onward through May the 17th, June the 21st, and so on. And the reason for that cautious but irreversible approach is that I think people would rather have certainty rather than urgency. And we're going as fast as we reasonably and responsibly can, but if it's a trade-off between haste and certainty, I think people would prefer certainty.
Now going to Tracy Brabin. Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister will appreciate parts of my constituency and others in West Yorkshire have been in heightened restrictions and higher tiers since last summer, when others had much more freedoms. Our people and businesses have paid a disproportionately high price in the national effort to tackle COVID. And because of this, many areas are building back from a more challenging position. So can the Prime Minister confirm today that funding packages will address this specific inequality and that there will be no return to regional tiers, ensuring our recovery from COVID is truly a national recovery?
Prime Minister.
Yes, she should wait to see what the Chancellor says next week, and we will make sure that we go forward as a one nation together.
William Ragg.
Madam Deputy Speaker, could I congratulate all of the staff and volunteers, particularly at the Boston Moor Surgery in Offerton in my constituency, where I had the privilege of joining them as a marshal for the car park on Friday afternoon as they administered over 500 vaccines. But my right honourable friend says that he is led by the data and not the dates, yet his statement outlines many dates. So will he commit to publishing the thresholds of data that will determine the easing of lockdown measures?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, he can examine all the data that we've published today, and I've set out the criteria by which we will proceed, and I thank him for what he's doing to marshal people in the car parks.
We now go to Christina Rees. Christina Rees.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 18th of February, the UK government announced £18.5 million for 4 research projects to better understand the causes, symptoms and treatment of long COVID. However, the linkage between sepsis and COVID and long sepsis and long COVID as evidenced by the UK Sepsis Trust, was not mentioned. Would the Prime Minister please outline his plans to make sure that this very important linkage will be included in these research projects?
Prime Minister.
Of course, we will look at sepsis, which I know is a deeply distressing condition, and whether it has any association with COVID.
We now move to Kate Griffiths. Kate Griffiths.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for setting out these measures today, and I know everyone is keen to start socialising in a safe way as soon as possible. Can I ask the Prime Minister to allow pubs to reopen their gardens as quickly as possible? If 6 people can buy alcoholic drinks from a shop and meet in a park, then I hope that pubs will be given a chance to provide a takeaway service for consumption in their gardens as soon as possible.
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, and that's why April the 12th is the date.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last month was the worst on record for new aircraft orders in the aerospace sector, which is so important to my constituency. Along with tourism, travel and aviation, as we've heard, will suffer a long time after these restrictions are lifted. So will the Prime Minister commit to continuing support for those areas of the economy that drive so much of the value in the economy, but will suffer from a much longer lag before they're able to pick up again?
Prime Minister.
He's quite right. That's why we've done everything we can with time to pay and other means to try to look after the aviation sector, though it's been incredibly hard for that sector, which matters a great deal to our country. The best way forward for them is to get people flying again. As I've said, I know it's a bit of time to wait, but the Travel Task Force will be reporting on April the 12th, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to make progress this summer, but we'll have to wait and see.
Now go to Bill Wiggin. Bill Wiggin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As an animal welfare champion, I was delighted to hear the Prime Minister mention zoos. But before we can get out there and go to the pubs and visit these places, I heard him describe certainty being more important than urgency, and his concern for the unprotected, unvaccinated element of the population who potentially could be holding the rest of us back. What more can we do to encourage people who might not have taken up the vaccine to make sure they get jabbed and let the rest of us out?
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful. Of course, we must encourage everybody to take the vaccine, which, as I say, is a wonderful thing. One of the problems is that it's at the moment we're not, as he knows, vaccinating children. Children are not approved for the vaccine, and though they are possible vectors of the disease, and there are people, as my honourable friend knows, who are vulnerable to the disease, even though they may have been vaccinated. There will be at least a percentage. So we've got to make sure we proceed with caution, but in a way that we don't have to go back on.
Now move to Drew Hendry. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Prime Minister and his government intend to do anything at all for the 3 million or so people who've been excluded from financial support since the start of this pandemic?
Prime Minister.
We've provided about £15 billion for the self-employed, and we'll continue to look after them in any way we can.
Now moving to Craig Tracy. Craig Tracy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I welcome Prime Minister setting out this roadmap as promised. And it's great to see that schools will be returning, including importantly with their sporting activities. But with this in mind, the 8th of March will also have been the optimum time to reintroduce for everyone non-contact sports, such as golf, which is scientifically proven to be able to be participated in safely during the pandemic. So could the Prime Minister set out why it's not been possible to do this at this stage, as it will leave millions of people having to wait for another 5 weeks before they can return to their favourite form of exercise?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is quite right to vent his frustration. I share his frustration as somebody who yearns to go out and play sport. Myself, I understand completely how he feels. We must face the fact that the virus remains, by comparison with any period last year, the virus remains very prevalent in our country. and we have to continue to keep it under control. What we're trying to do is a cautious but irreversible approach, and he only has to wait until for another 3 weeks beyond March the 8th to be able to hit a golf ball with a friend, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Now moving to Emma Lewell-Buck. Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister's handling of this pandemic has been marked by false promises and inconsistent messaging. Hospitality was COVID secure, yet they were imposed with an arbitrary curfew, then closed down. And today, this industry, which is the lifeblood of coastal tourist towns like mine, have heard that people can meet outside in a park, yet outdoor areas of safe, regulated pubs, bars and restaurants can't open till April. They simply cannot see the logic behind this. Can the Prime Minister explain where he found it?
Prime Minister.
The logic, Madam Deputy Speaker, it lies in containing a pandemic. And I think people in this country understand that, but I deeply sympathise with the businesses in her constituency, the wonderful hospitality sector across the country. They have a date now to work for, to look forward to for outdoor hospitality and for indoor hospitality. And I think people would rather have certainty than anything else.
Moving to Raymond Chisty. Raymond Chisty.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Further to my question to the Prime Minister, on the 27th of January, and representations from Medway MPs. Medway will now have a mass vaccination centre, and I thank the Prime Minister and the Government for that. The impact of COVID-19 on the mental health and well-being of young people has been repeatedly raised with me by local schools and the local university. The Children's Commissioner, Anne Longfield, has suggested that all schools should have a dedicated mental health worker in schools. Is that something that the government will be looking to take forward, or will there be specific alternative support for young people? And with that, I thank the Prime Minister for his recent response to me with regards to the report I sent him from Professor Young at King's College London on mental health and COVID-19.
Prime Minister.
I'm congratulate him on the people of Raynham on the vaccine centre and everything that they're doing. On mental health, he's completely right to raise it, but that's why we've were investing massively in supporting children's and adult mental health, and I've recently appointed Alex George to be a mental health ambassador for young people.
Tamanjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Prime Minister charts his roadmap out of this third national lockdown, undoubtedly he has presided over a disastrous response to the pandemic, one of the worst in the world, wherein the sluggishness, double-mindedness and mixed messaging has led to billions of pounds of taxpayer money going into crony contracts to firms with links to the Tory party. We've got one of the worst major economic crises in the world of any major economy, and the worst death toll within Europe, wherein more than 100,000 people have died, including members of my family. So will the Prime Minister like to take this opportunity to apologise to the British people and reassure them that the steps that he is now taking will not lead us into yet another lockdown?
Prime Minister.
The purpose of this roadmap is to be cautious but irreversible. And if I take it from what he just said, that he supports that roadmap, then I'm glad to have his support.
We now go to Martin Vickers. Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I fully support my right honourable friend's cautious approach to the lockdown. However, he will know that coastal resorts have been particularly badly hit, as they rely to a considerable extent on the hospitality sector. That said, Northern Lincolnshire and the Humber can play a major part in the post-pandemic economic recovery. Can the Prime Minister give an assurance that the government will continue to support both established and new businesses in the area?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, we will make sure that we support businesses throughout the pandemic, and I'm absolutely certain that the hospitality industry in Cleethorpes and surrounding area will bounce back very strongly indeed.
Lambos, Cheryl Lambos.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister in his statement indicated that wearing face masks will still be a factor in the fight against COVID over the months ahead. Yet many people with hidden disabilities are unable to wear face masks, and yet many of them face abuse when they go out in public and people don't realise that they're exempt from wearing face coverings. So can the Prime Minister give a commitment to have a public awareness campaign for people with hidden disabilities so they don't face abuse in public?
Prime Minister.
He raises a very important point, and I will make sure that we do even more to get that point over to people, so that people who can't wear face masks because of their disabilities don't face that kind of abuse.
Now go to Sir John Redwood. Sir John.
Will the government do more to improve airflow and control and extraction in health settings and make more safe use of powerful ultraviolet cleaners to reduce cross-infection further?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend raises a very interesting point. I know that our scientific advisors are looking at everything we can do, including the means he suggests, in order to reduce transmission of the disease.
Now go to Stephen Bonner. Stephen Bonner.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. Scientific research from leading Scottish universities has today shown substantial reductions in serious COVID-19 hospital admissions following administration of the first dose of the vaccine. Given this success, does the Prime Minister not agree with me? It is now time to prioritise critical public servants, such as our teachers and other key workers, to ensure maximum protections are in place as we begin to ease our way out of this lockdown.
Prime Minister.
I think that most people in this House would agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the JCVI was right in their prioritisation of those who are most vulnerable, and that our ambition in the vaccine rollout programme should be to vaccinate, firstly, those who are most at risk of serious disease and death, and that is the right approach.
Moving to Andrew Bowie. Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's statement this afternoon and very much hope that it is matched by the First Minister's statement to the Scottish Parliament tomorrow, because it is better for business, not least the tourism and hospitality sector, that the whole country moves at the same pace. In that vein, does the Prime Minister agree with me that the incredible success pace and take-up of the vaccine just shows what this country can achieve when we do it together?
Prime Minister.
He is completely right. My honourable friend is completely right. It's been a stunning example of the whole of the UK working together to roll out a programme that's been absolutely vital for our whole country. And cooperation with the DAs has been terrific on this, but it's something that could not have been achieved without the UK working together.
Moving to Stephen Kinnock. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister should know that there can be no post-pandemic economic recovery without a strong and healthy UK steel industry. But he should also know that our steel workers are having to compete with one hand tied behind their backs because our electricity costs our steelmakers 86% more than Germany and 62% more than in France. What steps will the Prime Minister be taking to reduce British electricity costs to internationally competitive levels so that our steel industry can thrive in the wake of this pandemic?
Prime Minister.
He raises a very important point, and of course that was one of the consequences of the some of the taxes and some of the skewing of the prices that have been chosen over many years by government. We want to make sure that we have a steel industry in this country that is able to compete, and that we must indeed address the discriminatory costs of energy. He's completely right to raise it.
Just a quick reminder, this is about the COVID statement. So we now move to Andrew Selous.
Thank you very much on behalf of Whipsnade Zoo. But will the Prime Minister now instruct that a further test case be taken to the courts so that those hospitality businesses whose business interruption insurance is still not paying out can get the relief that they need, having paid thousands in premiums for decades in some cases?
Prime Minister.
I do hope that the businesses concerned receive the the compensation that they are owed and deserve from their insurance packages. But in the meantime, I would just urge him to look out for what the Chancellor is going to say next week by way of continued support.
Now go to Naz Shah. Naz Shah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do welcome the roadmap that has been put before the House this afternoon, certainly because Bradford has had extra restrictions since July. And my question really to the Prime Minister is, he has outlined that hospitality, the industry, will be open by the 12th of April, but wedding industry won't be till June the 21st at the larger venues. That's another 10 weeks for some businesses. That 10 weeks could be the difference between closure and bankruptcy. And we have some amazing wedding venues in Bradford. It's a big part of our industry here. And they can open like restaurants with 2 meters apart. So I'd urge the Prime Minister to reconsider whether we could look at wedding venues being opened sooner. And I would invite him to come and look at some of our amazing wedding venues in Bradford West. We have so many beautiful ones.
Thank you. Prime Minister.
Well, I'm very happy to take up her invitation to visit the beautiful wedding venues of Bradford. I know they have an extraordinary, they do an amazing job there. But just an answer to her point, we can't do full Cecil B. DeMille weddings earlier than June the 21st. We can do smaller weddings before then, as she knows, but at least the great businesses she talks about now have a date to think about and to aim for.
Richard Fuller.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and in particular the inclusion of dates that help businesses plan. But with respect to international travel, the inside page of our passport states that in the name of Her Majesty, all those whom it may concern, to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance. And with regard to quarantine hotels, may I remind the Prime Minister that just because a policy is popular does not mean it is right.
Prime Minister.
I have a high regard for my honourable friend, who I've known for many years, and I know he speaks for many in our party and beyond in what he says. These are very difficult judgments to make, as I know he appreciates. But I think that it is right when you're facing a pandemic like this and the risk of new variants to have a very tough borders and quarantine policy indeed.
Now move to Janet Davey. Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has been asked several times about how the government procured contracts during this pandemic. My question to the Prime Minister is slightly different, and if there are any plans for the government to claw back on any of the funds on pandemic contracts that have failed, for example, delivering unusable or unsafe PPE at the great expense of the taxpayer.
Prime Minister.
99.5% of the PPE that we have received has been of a high standard, but of course where people have fallen down on their contracts, we will claw back the money that we've paid.
Now move to Paul Bristow. Paul Bristow.
I want to congratulate our NHS and my right honourable friend for the great British success story that is the vaccination programme. Because the UK is ahead of others on vaccination, we can open up sooner. My right honourable friend said he would focus on data, not dates. But these 5-week dates seem arbitrary. If progress against the 4 tests look better than expected, might the government be flexible and review the data and restrictions on a weekly or fortnightly basis and not on predetermined dates?
Prime Minister.
These not before dates aren't arbitrary, they're crucial, and they're determined by the time you need to evaluate the impact on the pandemic of the openings up that we're doing. And so you need 4 weeks to see, for instance, whether the opening of schools has caused an uncontrollable surge in the pandemic, and then a week to give advice and so on. So they're not arbitrary, they're dictated by the science, and that is the right way forward. But if you look at the overall roadmap, it is, I think, beyond what many other countries are currently able to achieve, and that, as he rightly says, is thanks to the rollout of the vaccination programme.
Moving to Andy Slaughter. Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 5 local NHS areas in England, including Hampstead and Fulham, have vaccinated 73% or less of the over 70s, despite the very best efforts of NHS and public health staff and volunteers. This falls to a 60% take-up for the most deprived 10th of residents and below 50% for some ethnic minority groups. As the country moves on to vaccinate younger and less at-risk groups, what comfort can the Prime Minister give to the quarter of my elderly, vulnerable constituents that his government have left behind?
Prime Minister.
Take-up is accelerating actually amongst all those groups, but he's right to say that it's been slower in some groups than others, and that's why we've rolled out the network of community champions. But it's also important for him and for all of us ourselves to champion the uptake of vaccines across all our communities in our constituencies.
Now moving to Mike Wood. Mike Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The vaccine rollout has been more successful than even the most optimistic of us could have predicted in December. And while the Prime Minister is clearly right to insist that this roadmap must be irreversible so that we don't risk a further lockdown, will he make sure that if vaccinations prove to be as effective as we all hope, the government can still continue to review whether later stages might progress more quickly as long as the number of deaths and hospital admissions continue to fall?
Prime Minister.
He makes a very interesting point, which I'm sure that will have occurred to many other colleagues and to people up and down the country. I've given the reason for the interval between the dates that I've set out and why we need to be able to be certain about the impact of the relaxations that we're making, the 4 weeks plus 1 that we need. But the other point I would make, because he makes a very interesting point, the other point I would make is I think people would much rather have a date that they know is as certain at this stage as we can possibly be to fix on and to work towards, rather than more uncertainty and fluidity than we need.
61 withdrawn, so we go to James Wild. James.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week I met Kathy, the practice manager, and the team, including volunteers at St James Medical Practice, who vaccinated thousands of people in northwest Norfolk. Will my honourable friend join with me in paying tribute to them and those other sites in Kings Lynn and Snettisham who are making it possible to reopen our hospitality sector, albeit more slowly than some would want, as well as, very importantly, reopening our schools and other businesses in the coming weeks?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I do. And I thank everybody involved in the vaccination programme in northwest Norfolk, and I thank my honourable friend for championing the vaccinators.
We go to Alison Thewlis. Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much. The APPG gaps in support heard evidence last week on how tens of thousands of women have been forgotten about during this pandemic. So will the Prime Minister meet with Maternity Action, Pregnant Then Screwed, Bethany Power and Snala Joshi to hear how he can redress the balance and how he can redress the unfairness that those who were pregnant and on maternity leave have faced during the pandemic?
Prime Minister.
She raises an important point. I'll certainly make sure that the relevant minister receives such a delegation.
Now move to Julian Sturdy. Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In view of the Prime Minister's sensible commitment to act on the basis of data, not data, which I fully support, can he clarify if there is scope and flexibility in his roadmap to go faster in relaxing restrictions if the vaccination programme proceeds more rapidly than expected and the data shows enhanced effectiveness of the vaccine as more of that data comes forward, resulting in radically reduced transmission and hospital admissions? Surely, if we're following the data, that flexibility has to work both ways.
Prime Minister.
This is all. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. This is already a very fast unlocking programme by other international standards. The timetable is dictated, as I've explained, by the intervals we need to evaluate the effect of each successive lockdown. And I think what people want to see, what businesses want, is as much certainty as possible rather than uncertainty. And that's what we aim to provide.
Going to Ben Bradshaw. Ben Bradshaw.
Forgive me, Madam Deputy Speaker. I didn't hear the Prime Minister's reply just then because one of the Zoom operators was talking to another member. But the Prime Minister is absolutely right to say that we should be driven by the data and not dates, and that his dates are therefore subject to review. But given the stunning success of the vaccination programme, with the evidence today of how it prevents serious illness and death, why is he not prepared to bring his dates forward as well as back if the data justifies that?
Prime Minister.
He didn't hear my answer to the last question, so I'll repeat it because his question is really identical to several previous questions. The answer is that you need time to evaluate the success or otherwise of each lockdown, of each unlocking. And you need 4 weeks to see what's happened. And bear in mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we are dealing with a disease that is extremely contagious, and large numbers of people who are still unvaccinated and still very vulnerable. So we have to proceed with caution. So that's why there's the interval, the 5-week interval that we have. And the second reason is that we want a timetable that we can stick to. And I think people would really much rather have a sense of certainty and security, the maximum possible certainty and security, rather than any sense that it's fluid again and they could move one way, or the date they have in their heads could change. And I think that is very, very important. Certainty in this particular case, in this particular roadmap, is of great value.
66 withdrawn, so we go to Geraint Davis. Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Prime Minister, in Wales, excess deaths over the 5-year average are 13% more compared to 20% more in England. So will the Prime Minister ensure on the UK government website that it says if you live in more highly infectious areas of England, you should not travel to Wales?
Prime Minister.
The restrictions throughout the country apply both in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. They will continue to apply for the duration of the pandemic.
Moving to Robert Halfon. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I really welcome the Prime Minister's statement, which will give certainty to businesses and constituents in Harlow. And it's really good news about school reopenings on the 8th of March. Given that so many children have lost months of school, impacting their education, attainment and mental health, will he ensure that every pupil is assessed for their loss of learning and how much catch-up is needed? And will he consider extending the school day, not by putting an extra burden on teachers and support staff, but by using civil society to offer sporting activities, mental health support and academic catch-up where necessary?
Prime Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend. That's exactly why I've appointed Sir Kevin Collins to be the Educational Recovery Commissioner, to champion all those ideas, all those initiatives that he's just rightly mentioned, and he'll be hearing more about that all later this week.
Now going to Joanna Cherry. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. While the government's announcement that indoor care home visiting for one named person, one named relative, is to be permitted from 8th March, while that sounds like progress, the fact that this remains a matter for guidance only is very concerning. The Joint Committee on Human Rights has heard too many examples of previous guidance on this issue not being followed, denying meaningful visits when these might safely be facilitated. The Joint Committee has drafted regulations that would ensure that nobody in a care home was denied a face-to-face visit without a carefully thought-through, individualised risk assessment. Will the Prime Minister commit to bringing these regulations into force?
Prime Minister.
Well, I just direct the right honourable lady to what I said earlier on about ensuring that people do get the ability to see a nominated visit her, and also to remind her of the sad reality of the infection that we've seen in care homes and the need to protect against it. There is a balance to be struck, as she knows.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for his statement. Everyone, especially young people, small businesses in the hospitality and pub sector in North West Durham, but across the country, have made massive sacrifices to achieve the huge progress in tackling the pandemic. As long as the government's world-leading vaccine programme continues, the roadmap means we'll now be off almost restrictions by late June, with that certain approach the Prime Minister is pushing for. Therefore, can I extend to him an invitation to the Prime Minister, his fiancée Carrie, Wilfred and Dylan to visit North West Durham this summer to see some of Britain's most beautiful but least well-known countryside?
I thank my honourable friend. I can't think. Wild horses wouldn't keep me away from North West Durham. I can tell him that.
We now go to Asfal Khan. Asfal Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Earlier this month, nearly half of constituents I surveyed reported severe levels of financial insecurity. Shockingly, almost a third also said they struggle to afford daily living costs. This is the financial reality of millions around the country. One respondent told me that they feel hopeless, utterly hopeless about their financial situation. The Prime Minister could now deliver some peace of mind for my constituents by agreeing to extend the support schemes that have kept many families afloat during this crisis. This includes expanding payments for people self-isolating. Will he do so?
Prime Minister.
We'll continue to look after people throughout the pandemic.
Jacob Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our vaccine rollout so far has been an amazing success, and I want to thank those at Eston PCN, Redcar Hospital, James Cook and the government for their efforts in delivering it. We're hitting targets and reaching new milestones each day, and soon we will have the Novavax vaccine made in Teesside to help us as well. Can I ask the Prime Minister when he expects this new Teesside vaccine to be approved by the MHRA?
I was thrilled to go up to Teesside and to see the site where the Novavax vaccine will be made, and in fact to look at one of the bioreactors that will be used. I can't give an exact date by which the MHRA will give approval, but we're pretty confident, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it will be forthcoming before too long.
Now going to Graham Morris. Graham Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware of the Catch Up with Cancer campaign and the urgent need for funding to clear the cancer backlog? Otherwise, we risk turning the COVID crisis into a cancer crisis with tens of thousands more lives lost. Will he commit to the funding to create a world-class cancer service and work with the Catch Up with Cancer campaign to deliver the investment we need in the cancer workforce, in new equipment, and in the IT networks that we urgently need to tackle this backlog?
Prime Minister.
Yes, and he makes a very important point. That's why we're investing, I think, an extra £52 billion into the NHS, but also tackling the backlog caused by the pandemic in cancer and many other conditions. And I think the point that he makes should be attended to by all those who think that it is somehow that another wave of COVID is something we can simply put up with easily. Madam Deputy Speaker, the NHS is already under terrific pressure, and the more COVID we have, the more it displaces other vital treatments, as he rightly points out.
Now moving to Ben Bradley. Ben Bradley.
This morning I visited the Manor Academy in Mansfield Woodhouse to see the amazing job they've done setting up COVID testing for pupils and staff. They're very keen to see their children back in school, as they know the inequalities that existed pre-COVID will only have been exacerbated by closures. So can my right honourable friend assure the House that wide-ranging support will be offered to schools to address not just academic issues, but the social and emotional challenges that many children will face as a result of those closures?
Prime Minister.
Yes, and one of the most important things I think you can do is not just supporting kids' mental health and addressing those issues, helping teachers to address them, but also investing in one-on-one tutoring. that I think could be of massive value to kids who've come under particular stress, kids who've fallen behind, but also kids who may show great potential that needs to be unleashed. And so one-to-one tutoring is something we're going to be investing in heavily.
Moving to Dr. Rupa Huq. Rupa Huq.
Madam Deputy Speaker, to add to the various helter-skelter of pending cliff edge dates, stamp duty, eviction ban, business rates, UC, furlough, one ended yesterday, a little-known one, when the 4 months of free vitamin D supplied to the shielding, the expiry date to claim, ended. Can you tell us, will the 1.7 new shielders just added to the list be eligible for this? Can he advertise it more widely? And indeed, given how vitamin D builds immunity to all viruses, even for people who are not yet eligible for their vaccination, can he commit to a year-long advertising campaign for all? Kellogg's are on board. Will he do it?
Minister.
I thank her very much for what she says about vitamin D. I think she's right about the value that vitamin can have, and we'll make sure that we give it due publicity.
Moving to Mark Menzies. Mark Menzies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would like to welcome the Prime Minister's statement today and also to acknowledge the tremendous leadership that he has shown in driving forward the vaccine programme. But as my right honourable friend is aware, tourism and hospitality sectors are vital to the foiled economy, and they are ready and willing to trade their way to recovery. Can my right honourable friend assure me that he will keep this sector at the front of his thoughts, both ahead of next week's budget and when implementing his roadmap?
Prime Minister.
The tourism sector is absolutely vital for our country, and the faster we can get it open, the better. But the best way to open it up the fastest is to have a roadmap from which we don't deviate and on which we're not forced to go backwards. And that's what we're setting out to do. I'm glad we have his support.
Going to Ruth Cadbury. Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister has today both acknowledged the importance of holidays abroad, but also that strict quarantine is essential to address global transmission of COVID. The aviation sector has estimated that at best aviation will only return in the UK to a third of 2019 levels this year, and full recovery could take 5 years. So when will the government be releasing their delayed aviation recovery plan, and what additional support will the government be providing for communities like mine and like the Prime Minister's who are very dependent on the aviation sector for employment?
Prime Minister.
She'll be hearing a lot more about that and other matters on April the 12th.
Moving to Dr. James Davis. Dr. James Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend has quite rightly placed an emphasis on the reopening of schools, with a return to school of all children in England on the 8th of March. In Wales, primary school children aged 7 and under will return this week, while it's hoped that the remainder of primary school children and some older pupils taking qualifications may return on the 15th of March. However, there appear to be no plans for most secondary school pupils to return in Wales until after Easter, potentially beyond the reopening of some non-essential shops. Will the Prime Minister urge the Welsh Government to reconsider its approach, given the harm that young people have already endured during this pandemic?
Minister.
Well, thank my honourable friend. Obviously, that is a matter for the devolved authority, but I'm sure he shares my hope that all pupils will be back in school as fast as possible, and that we'll hear from the Labour Party in Wales that schools are safe.
Moving to Maria Eagle. Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In Liverpool, only 23% of those who applied for test, trace and isolate payment received it, and over 2/5 of them received a discretionary payment from money which is now exhausted. Now, effectively facilitating isolation is going to be key in preventing the resurgence of the virus via new strains, which might compromise the vaccine. So does the Prime Minister accept that eligibility for the test, trace and isolate payment is not drawn widely enough to provide support to those who need it and who can't afford to stop work without extra help? And will he agree to extend it to include all of those people who have no access to statutory sick pay?
Prime Minister.
We'll continue to support all those who are isolating. Indeed, we will do what we can to increase our support for them, but we will also support everybody throughout this pandemic, and she should wait for the Chancellor and the budget next week.
Steve Bryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to welcome and indeed raise a hallelujah that the good sense and we're standing with parents and children as all pupils will return from March the 8th. It's the right thing to do on so many levels. Can I ask the Prime Minister, though, what evidence has driven his decision that outdoor sport, not in-school outdoor sport, wider outdoor sport, for those same children cannot go ahead for at least another month? And after all the good work that they've done last year to create COVID-secure environments, restaurants and cafes face another 3 months before they can open in any meaningful way. What is the evidence that he's seen that's convinced him to make that decision today? Thank you.
Actually, actually, outdoor sport for schools can go ahead from March the 8th, as I said earlier on, and the evidence for all the decisions that we've taken, a massive quantity of scientific evidence has been deposited today with the House.
We now go to Yvette Cooper. Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our COVID rates in Yorkshire have fallen much more slowly than in London and the South East, partly because fewer people can work from home and more people in our towns have to go out to work to keep our factories and distribution centres running. The Prime Minister keeps saying he's supporting self-isolation, but most workers are not getting that support, and that is particularly hitting our manufacturing towns. So will he think again? Will he extend that support, help those workers and help us get our rates down?
Prime Minister.
Thank her. We are indeed increasing our support, as I said, for people who are self-isolating, and we'll continue to look after workers throughout the pandemic. But the best thing for all those businesses is to continue, as they're doing in Yorkshire, to get the disease down and keep it under control.
I'm afraid we've mislaid Alex Shelbrooke, but we will try to return to him. So we move straight to Vicky Foxcroft.
Deputy Speaker, disabled people have been one of the hardest hit groups during this pandemic. Communication with disabled people and those shielding has been poor. Far too often, communications have been late and not in accessible formats. But the Prime Minister can seek to rectify this now. Will he provide a clear roadmap for those people shielding so they know when it's safe for them to rejoin society?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed, and it's here. It's the roadmap that she should have with her now, is online now, and the measures specifically for disabled people, for those shielding, are clearly set out.
Now moving to Simon Clarke. Simon Clarke.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate my right honourable friend on his sensible and measured statement, just as I echo my honourable friend for Redcar and thanking all those across the Tees Valley involved in the vaccine rollout so far. Children and parents will be delighted that schools across England return on the 8th of March. I fear greatly that white working class children will have borne the brunt in terms of lack of progress in educational attainment during this time. Can I urge a specific focus on targeted support for those young people as we rebuild our country?
Prime Minister.
We will, I'm really grateful, we will support all pupils who've suffered loss to their learning as a result of the pandemic, and that's why I think we've bought 1.3 million laptops. We've now distributed, put another billion and 1.3 billion into catch-up of all kinds. But you know, he's totally right to focus on this. It is, I think, the #1 challenge the country faces now.
Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our university students, many of whom are not eligible for furlough for their part-time jobs, were already struggling financially. Today's roadmap suggests the vast majority of those students won't be able to return to their university accommodation until after Easter at best. They're legally being prevented from returning to accommodation they're obliged to pay for. Does the Prime Minister think this fair? And if he doesn't think it's fair, what's he going to do about it?
Prime Minister.
I sympathise deeply with students who've had an absolutely, a time at university that no other generation has put up with. I sympathise deeply with their sense of unfairness, the experiences that they've had. They've also been heroic, by the way, in the way that they've been able to bring the disease down in some of their university towns through obeying the guidance. We will do whatever we can to support them, working with the university sector to make up for what they've the experiences that they've been through, and making sure that insofar as we can, we help them to get compensation.
Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I very much welcome the Prime Minister's statement today and a sustainable way out of this situation. And it is absolutely right that we prioritise the reopening of schools and getting all children back into the classroom. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that it is now essential that we work with parents and teachers and schools to develop a long-term plan for pupils to catch up on the education that they have missed out on, particularly in areas like Bolsover?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and that's why Sir Kevin Collins has been appointed as the Education Recovery Commissioner, and we'll be setting out plans that are intended not just to remediate the loss that kids have suffered during the pandemic, but also to take our educational system forward and to do things that possibly we wouldn't have done before, to find new ways of teaching and learning that will make up the difference for those kids and more.
So we've relocated Alex Shelbrook, so we'll go now to him. Alex Shelbrook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, in my constituency, there are a lot of strong community events, especially things such as Zumba classes, which I get a lot of emails on. So could I ask my right honourable friend, when does he envisage that indoor activities in village halls and the like for Zumba classes may be allowed to start again?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, if you can do outdoor Zumba, then you can. Then obviously March the 29th is the date for you. Always assuming you can't do it one-on-one, in which case you could do it earlier. But indoor, as he will have picked up from what I've said earlier, is currently down for May the 17th, along with all other indoor settings.
We now go to Navendu Mishra.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Macmillan Cancer Support has warned that more than 100,000 people live with cancer in the UK are struggling to cover basic living costs due to the impact of COVID-19. Tragically, many cancer patients who are having difficulty paying for essentials have experienced suicidal thoughts in recent months. Will the Prime Minister commit to making the £20 per week universal credit increase permanent and extend this uplift to legacy benefits?
Prime Minister.
He's totally right to raise the issue of cancer patients, other patients who need treatment, and we're going to do everything we can to clear the backlog as fast as we possibly can. That's one of the reasons we've got to keep the COVID virus going down, Madam Deputy Speaker, and he'll be hearing more next week from the Chancellor about supporting people across the country.
Sir Edward Lee.
It seems to me that many of the 88 people who've gone before me and who've been critical of the Prime Minister have been wise after the event. So let me now do precisely that and plead guilty to this charge. If severe quarantine measures from the very start have been so effective as in Australia, and equally if tough local lockdowns have been effective in China, doesn't that rather beg the question why we didn't do it over a year ago? I don't say this to be difficult, but to learn from the future and to ponder on what we should do next time. And I think many people in the country think that it's better to be tough on foreign travel than tough on children attending school.
I think he speaks for many people in the country, my old friend, when he says that we do have a very tough regime on international travel, one of the toughest in the world, and we will certainly be making sure we learn all the lessons we need to about the early handling of the pandemic.
Now go to Kerry McCarthy. Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Events and exhibitions companies in my constituency are
still struggling to get any support for lost business. The fact that they're not customer facing means they don't get the retail hospitality grant. The fact they haven't actually been forced to close, although they service businesses that have, means that they've lost out on the council's LSRG closed grant. They're not arts organisations as such, so they don't get the Arts Council funding. And the advice and guidance that is being given to local councils about what grants they should be giving to events and exhibition sector is incredibly vague and inconsistent. So what reassurance can the Prime Minister give me that in the Chancellor's budget next week, there will finally be help for those companies like the ones in my constituency that are just absolutely at their last legs?
Prime Minister.
I'm acutely conscious of the businesses that have fallen through the cracks, as it were. Madam Deputy Speaker, wholesalers, for instance, who find it difficult to qualify under one scheme or another. We're doing absolutely everything we can to make sure that we give the support that people want. There's extra discretionary funding available for councils to support such businesses, and she will be hearing more certainly from the Chancellor next week.
Anthony Mangnall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the Prime Minister's statement. Millions of young people have had their lives put on hold over the last 13 months. They have been the least likely to suffer severely from this virus. So I wonder if the Prime Minister can look ahead and just inform me and the House as to what we can do to help those university students who are going to enter the job market for the first time, those leaving school. Because right now they look ahead and they look post-lockdown into a world that is very uncertain, and their future must be safeguarded. So what can we do?
He raises a vital point, and that's why we've got the £2 billion kickstart funds in addition to many other schemes to help young people into work, to help them with what could be a very difficult transition. But the best thing possible is to get the economy open and firing again.
Patrick Grady.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The German equivalent of furlough, the Kurzarbeit scheme, will be accessible to employers until at least the end of this year. So given that he said the United Kingdom would prosper mightily outside the European Union, why can't his government provide that level, or why won't his government provide that level of certainty and support to employers on these islands so they can plan with some confidence for a new post-pandemic normal?
He'll be hearing a lot more next week about the support that we're going to give throughout the whole of the UK, and perhaps, while we're on the subject, perhaps he could confirm that the Scottish Nationalist Party would have remained in the European Medicines Agency. I think he's a member of the SNP.
Now go to Peter Bone. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last year, a wonderful young couple in my constituency had to cancel their wedding because of COVID. They contacted me this morning so that I could ask the Prime Minister whether he could guarantee their wedding would be able to go ahead on the 1st of July. And if he can, Rhiannon and Jordan will send a wedding invite in the post tonight.
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. I can't absolutely guarantee that Rhiannon and Jordan's wedding will be able to go ahead on the 1st of July, but if we can stick with this roadmap, and I hope very much that we can, then all is set fair for them, and I hope the sun will shine on them both, with or without my presence.
Now go to Zara Sultana. Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We have more than 120,000 COVID deaths, the highest death rate of any large country in the world, and the deepest recession of any major economy. This is the government's horrific pandemic record. The Prime Minister now claims that he's taken a cautious approach to easing restrictions, but government scientists themselves have warned that the Big Bang reopening of schools on March the 8th could lead to the infection rate rising above 1, triggering an exponential increase in cases. 9 education unions have described the plans as reckless. So instead of repeating his mistakes, will the Prime Minister listen to teachers and scientists and follow the devolved administrations with a phased return to schools?
Prime Minister.
Well, perhaps she might direct her fire at her own front bench and the Leader of the Opposition, Madam Deputy Speaker, because he's just quite rightly supported those plans. I think she had possibly been failing to pay attention. Oh no, he's withdrawing his support. I told you it was. There you go. We've been barely here 2 hours, Madam Deputy, and it's gone again. 1 minute you have it, the next minute it's gone. Anyway, I thought he was with us on reopening schools, but never mind.
Now go to Robin Miller. Robin Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The success of our North Wales economy is critically dependent on visitors from the rest of the UK and indeed the world. Llandudno is the queen of resorts and is the largest resort in Wales. Our hoteliers are eager to open their arms and offer a warm welcome once again to visitors. Will my right honourable friend continue his good work with the Welsh Government to ensure there are no obstacles put in the way of visitors? And can he also confirm that shared prosperity funds will be used to accelerate an economic recovery in places like Aberconwy?
Prime Minister.
I thought I heard my honourable friend say Llandudno, and I remember spending an absolutely hysterical New Year's Eve in the St Tidno Hotel, I think, in Llandudno, which in 1997, I seem to remember. Absolutely wonderful, wonderful year to be in. And I wish that hotel and all other hotels in Llandudno all the very best, and we'll get them open just as soon as we possibly can. I thank him for his representation.
We now go to Richard Bergen. Richard Bergen.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what the Prime Minister said about a zero COVID solution earlier is simply not true. Since he lifted lockdown prematurely in December, which I voted against, we've had 60,000 deaths compared to fewer than 1,400 deaths across all the countries with a zero COVID plan, despite their populations being 20 times bigger. Those unnecessary deaths are on him, and he is still refusing to learn the lessons. Last month, the Prime Minister called schools vectors of transmission, yet he is recklessly forcing 10 million school pupils and staff to return on just one day. Doesn't this run the very real risk of the virus running out of control yet again?
Prime Minister.
Well, there's one of those moments when I sympathise very much with the Leader of the Opposition, because there speaks the authentic voice of the union-dominated Labour left. I don't think that he's right in what he says. I think that most people in this country understand that schools need to go back, and they support it. And I've just heard from I just heard from the right honourable gentleman he does support that on March the 8th, which is good news.
We now go to Alberto Costa. Alberto Costa.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Prime Minister, you've timed step 2 perfectly. Why do I say that? Foss Shopping Park Centre in my constituency, one of Britain's biggest out-of-town shopping centres, has expanded with a £168 million investment, including the flagship Next UK store. Now, it was due to open last year. Obviously, COVID didn't allow that, but it will open just as soon as you allow it to open. Will you do it the honours, come and cut the ribbon, and help boost consumer confidence across our country?
Prime Minister.
Non-essential retail, as I've told the House, will be opening on April the 12th. Whether I'm essential to the opening of Foss Park, I doubt, but I'm very grateful to him for the invitation. I'm sure that if I can't get there, he'll do a magnificent job in my place.
We now go to Mohammed Yassin. Mohammed Yassin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very concerned about the large numbers of care home staff and black and ethnic minority groups who won't take up the vaccine. MPs and local authorities have been asking his government for weeks to supply the detailed data they need to identify and resolve vaccine non-compliance. As the Prime Minister knows, the vaccine rollout is a race against time. So will he make the data available today so we can ensure enough people take the vaccine to reach the herd immunity necessary to prevent another lockdown?
Prime Minister.
We're making as much data available as we possibly can. Clearly, you can't make people's medical records available because that breaches patient confidentiality. Madam Deputy Speaker, he's right to raise the question of take-up amongst some groups and care home staff. It has been increasing, but we need to all work together to make sure we encourage everybody to come forward and take a vaccine.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Prime Minister raised the possibility of new variants having an impact on the plan. Ordinarily, the laws of natural selection will favour more benign variants. However, lockdown reverses that, favouring the more potent. So in addition to an urgency on the basis of the economic and social costs of lockdown, there is indeed also a scientific urgency to lift it, isn't there?
Well, I defer to my honourable friend's doubtless superior understanding of the biology of the variants. But I just a couple of reassuring points for him. Number one, we think that we have no reason to think that our vaccines are ineffective in preventing death or serious illness against all the variants that we're currently aware of. And the second thing is that we're getting ever better, or our scientists are getting ever better at evolving new vaccines to tackle the new variants.
Now go to Tim Farron. Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is right to focus upon prioritising education and saying that outdoor activities are things that people can now do more freely, or at least will over the coming weeks and months. But he says nothing about outdoor education, which is an industry is of vast importance to us in the lakes and in the dales, and of great value to young people right across the country. There are 15,000 people employed in this sector, at least there were. 6,000 have now lost their jobs. If we lose that sector, it will be very, very difficult to ever get it back, and we will suffer hugely as a country if that happens. So will he agree to reopen outdoor education for residential stays from the summer term so that we take advantage of the skills that these people in outdoor education, the professionals have, to help our young people to re-engage with a love of learning and to tackle many of the mental health issues that we face? And if he's not able to make that guarantee, will he at least do what has happened in Northern Ireland and Scotland and create and provide a bespoke financial package to support and to save our outdoor education sector?
Right on, Government makes a really interesting point. As you know, indoor education is opening on March the 8th. So given that transmission is much less likely outdoors, I would have thought that a fortiori, outdoor education should be able to open on the same date. But I'll make sure that we get back to him if that should for any reason turn out not to be the case. I can't see why it shouldn't be the case, but we'll get back to him.
Final question, Jason McCartney. Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And as the owner of one of my local hair salons has just said, the future now looks a little brighter thanks to this roadmap. Will the Prime Minister join me in thanking the wonderful volunteers, GPs, pharmacies and nurses who have helped administer thousands of vaccines in my area? And finally, can he also make sure that the Chancellor announces in his budget support for the wedding, hospitality and event sectors who will have to wait just a little bit longer now before they can fully reopen safely?
Yes, sir.
I think he's caught the tone of it exactly right, that there is just a little bit longer to go now. The Chancellor will be setting out the support that we need to put in place for all the businesses that he mentions. I echo his support and his thanks to them, particularly to hair salons, which I look forward to being able to use without too much delay myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and am now suspending. Point of order, Steve Bryan.
Thank you very much for that. The Prime Minister has obviously today outlined a very helpful roadmap for reopening our economy and our society. Can I ask the Chair whether any such plan exists for our House of Commons? The Prime Minister obviously referred to Parliament in his statement. The House of Commons, by any standard, remains a shadow of its former self in terms of the debate that's held, let alone the range and the effectiveness of the scrutiny of the executive, which is, after all, our job. So can I ask whether any plan exists for our House of Commons and when we might get sight of that?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving notice of his point of order. As he knows, the House's procedures have adapted and continue to adapt in the light of COVID-19. I do understand the points that he makes, but it will be up to the government to bring forward a motion to extend or amend our current arrangements, and I'm sure that ministers, including the Prime Minister, will have heard his comments. So I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes to make the necessary arrangements for the next